The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're going to get started with the webinar in just a few more seconds. We'll let more folks trickle in before we get started. Okay, we'll get started with the webinars. Thank you all for joining. This is the webinar on American Attitudes on a Green New Deal. My name is Helena Rim, and I'm a project manager at the local government commission. We've worked with ecoAmerica for several years now, and we do our best to support each other's work wherever we can, including this webinar, for example. So I just wanted to first and foremost extend a quick thank you from LGC for all the collaboration. I also want to thank the attendees, especially from California. We had over 40 cities represented in our registrant list, so thank you for joining, and thank you everyone else for joining us today. With that said, I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Megan Spicer. Megan is ecoAmerica's executive director and has helped the organization achieve its mission of building institutional leadership, public support, and political will for climate solutions since 2008. Megan lives in San Francisco with her husband and 2 children. So with that said, I'd like to pass it over to Megan.
Thanks so much, Helena, and thanks everyone for being on this webinar today. You know, a lot of you are very interested in how to move this issue forward, and we are thankful of your leadership, of you joining today, and understand that many of you are from a variety of different communities or working in a variety of different communities, maybe not all forward on this issue. So we hope that our webinar today will help you in your work. I just want to start by saying who we are. We're ecoAmerica, and we are a nonprofit. Our mission is to build public support and political will for climate. And we do so by conducting a lot of research to inform where Americans are on this issue, how to move them towards climate change. And then we apply our research to help national organizations in health, faith, and local communities to lead on this issue in ways that are relevant to them and their constituencies. We share our research broadly because we believe that anyone working on this issue should have the best data. And so we truly want to help others, even beyond those we work with directly, but we are a very happy partner of LGC and happy to be here today. Lake Research Partners was a partner of ours in this research that we're sharing, and they have been doing polling for over 30 years, and we've worked with them on a variety of projects. So the research we share today is a combined effort. So for you to know that our survey methodology of the research we're sharing specifically today was done through an omnibus survey. We had over 1,000 American adults, 18 years and older, to know that this is a nationally representative sample of Americans, and the margin of error is 2.9%. We conducted this research in February of this year, so it's pretty fresh. So we're happy to share it with you today. So before we dive into the specific findings, we want to do a little bit of context for you. Where are Americans generally on climate change? What we have on the screen now are some results from Gallup survey and ABC News Washington Post poll that really asked towards the end of last year, you know, where is climate change relative to other issues for Americans? Gallup asked, you know, Gallup asked, how important is it to you that the president and Congress deal with the following issues? And what you see here is that climate change is still an extremely important issue for them. It's below other issues like education, gun policy, the economy, but still 31% of Americans believe that it's extremely important for the president and Congress to deal with climate change. So higher number than in past years. Similarly, while climate change is somewhat of a second tier issue, it continues to rise in priority. And those of us on the phone on this webinar know that it intersects with some of these other issues like healthcare, the economy, immigration, taxes, and even security. And so the more we can make this connection with Americans, both on the impacts of climate change and on solutions, the more they will understand how it affects them personally and want to do something about that. So what this poll shows is that Americans are starting to understand that climate change is personal, that it's getting closer to them, that it's no longer distant, abstract, far away. What it shows is nearly half of voters say that climate change is a critical threat to the United States in the next 10 years. And so nearly half of Americans believe that. And if you look at that in relative priority, you can see that it's up there in top priorities of critical threats over the next 10 years. We take a look at concern as a measure of whether Americans are going to act on this issue. And so we see some promising information here. Majorities across party lines are personally concerned about climate change. That includes Democrats, independents, and Republicans. So if you take a look, 73% of Americans are concerned about this issue. That is largely led by Democrats, but it also is a majority of independents and over half of Republicans. So taken as a whole, the voting populace is concerned about this issue. We also, in an area of partisanship, asked a question back in August of last year. And we asked Americans whether they believe Republicans and Democrats should work together to address climate change. And we were very excited about these findings. 90% of all Americans believe that Republicans and Democrats should find ways to work together. Even 83% of Republicans believe this. So it shows a real, not so latent interest in Americans for our politicians to be working together on solutions. They want to see that leadership. Pew also does an annual survey of top priorities for the president and Congress. And you can see here that trending over the last 10 years, climate change overall has trended upward for Democrats in particular, but even also for Republicans. That's the image on the left. On the image on the right is about protecting the environment. Again, we're at 81% for Democrats and even 37% for Republicans. You can see here, there's an upward trend, a positive momentum. This next piece of information is from Gallup. I never want to pit the environment versus the economy because it's a false choice. However, it does show where Americans are on this issue and seeing if they believe that it is a false choice. The good news is, again, we're trending upward. More and more Americans are seeing that the environment is a priority over the economy. That delta is now over 20%, which is positive news. And so again, more fodder for us to move forward. ecoAmerica also asked the question of, do Americans see the benefit of acting on climate? If Americans are hearing any news at all on climate change, often it is the bad news. It's either about the impacts of climate change, the devastation of major storms, or solutions, maybe they will hurt our pocketbooks. We can't stress enough that we have to focus on the benefits of our solutions. The good news is Americans are starting to see it. if you take a look at the question we ask, if the United States took steps to help prevent future climate change, how would it affect the economy, your health, and jobs? Overall, Americans are starting to see the benefits to the economy. 61% believe it will help the economy. And that is largely led by Democrats and independents, but even 45% of Republicans see that. Your health is a clear winner. Again, still room to grow here, but 66% of Americans see that addressing climate change will benefit our health. And that's even half of Republicans believe that. And jobs is just 56% of Americans see the benefits to jobs. So there's a lot of room to grow in showing that connection. So now we'll move on to support for climate solutions. What do Americans support? What we try to do when we ask this question is steer away from the labels that people have been giving to certain solutions and really ask in a descriptive way what Americans think about specific solutions and would they support them. But to start, we want to show some research from Yale and George Mason University. They asked specifically about Green New Deal back in December, and this was before all the news coverage of it. And you can see here that before it really hit the news, 81% of all voters favored Green New Deal. That's including 92% of Democrats, 88% of independents, and 64% of Republicans. But as we saw, happening in the news media, the Green New Deal was started to get labeled. People started picking up the label and sort of associating it with negativity. And so these numbers have dropped since. We don't have that data to share with you, but what we decided to do back in February of this year is to say, how do we get beyond the label and look at the components of the Green New Deal and see what Americans think about that. And so you see here that Americans across political parties favor a variety of climate solutions. They really favor them strongly. This is not light support. So it's good news for us who are trying to bring solutions forward. The number one solution that they support is modernizing America's electric grid. That is broad, strong support across political parties, so 87% total. And all in the high 80s across the board. Charging corporate polluters a fee for the pollution they create is basically a descriptive term for carbon tax or carbon pricing. That enjoys 83% overall support. Passing laws for more efficient cars and buildings, 81%. And you can see here, we didn't shy away from asking the question of passing laws or charging. It's because we wanted to make sure that we could talk about laws and regulations and taxes, but in a new and fresh way. And even when we did that, we still saw that Americans support in high majorities. So expanding public transit, 80%, corporate tax credits to expand clean energy is 79%, and even personal tax credits for electric or hybrid cars is 76%. And we know in California there's that program and it's working well. So as we moved into looking at the specific policies that are in the Green New Deal, so now taking a closer look in at some of the categories of solutions that the Green New Deal hopes to bring forward, we also see a lot of strong support across the board. So taking a look at one of the first components of Green New Deal is developing technologies that remove carbon pollution from the air. 79% of Americans support that, and again, by a 71-point margin. So far more people support it than don't support it. And we left it at that. We didn't describe what that technology was. We really just took a look at how Americans were responding. They liked that idea. Second is providing training for jobs and support for communities as we transition to a new green economy. Some folks talk about this as just transition. That enjoyed 74% support. Again, with a 61-point margin, that is very significant. It just really shows how we can connect solutions for climate change to the economy, to jobs. Americans really like that, and it is a reality, and it is an opportunity for us as a movement. We asked about speeding up the transition to clean sources of energy like wind and solar. 71% really like that, again with a 56-point margin, super strong support. When we asked about it in a way of generating 100% of the nation's electricity from clean sources like wind and solar within 10 years, still pretty strong support, but not as wide of a margin as speeding up the transition. Some folks in the movement are promoting nuclear as a solution. So we put that into the survey to see how Americans are responding to that. What we see is 63% of Americans support preserving nuclear power plants, specifically because it says that it does not create carbon pollution. But when we asked about rapidly transitioning away from energy sources like coal, oil, and natural gas, we got a little bit of a mixed response. So 58% support it, not bad, but certainly not as strong as speeding up the transition to clean energy sources like wind and solar. So diving in a little bit of who is supporting technologies that remove carbon pollution from the air, you can see here that 79% favor it. That's pretty strong. But if you take a look again at deeper at the different demographics that support it, you see here that ages 40 to 49, 50 to 64, and 65 and older have a bit higher interest in this. Democrats, as well as Clinton voters, are a little bit stronger in their support for this solution. If you take a look at providing trainings and jobs for communities, again, broad support of favor. It was the top proposal for African American voters. So while everybody supports this, it particularly resonated with African Americans. As I mentioned earlier, we asked the question in two different ways. One is, should we speed up the transition to clean energy sources like wind and solar, or should we generate 100% of our nation's electricity from clean energies like wind and solar within 10 years? You could see one was get her going, get it done. The other one was a bunch of numbers. And what we see here is Americans are resonating much more with this idea of speeding up, get it going, get it done. Speed up the transition. When we talk about it in a sense of 100% within the next 10 years, again, still fairly broad support, but as you will see, we lose some key constituencies when we frame it in that way. And here are the results of that. On the left, we talk about speeding up the transition to clean energy sources like wind and solar, and you can see here broad majority support, particularly strong with women, African Americans, and Democrats. When we talk about it as 100% within 10 years, not as strong margins. Again, great favorability, but the margin of favor is lower, and we lose some key constituencies like Republicans and Trump voters. So taking a look at that more closely, you can see here the strongly favor among Democrats. There's some shift. Even within Democrats, they prefer the speeding up the transition over 100% in 10 years. But the big shift is with Republicans. You can see here how strong the speeding the transition up is 57% versus that support it versus 33 oppose. Whereas if you say 100% in 10 years, it's roughly equally split between favor and oppose. So if we're looking for a voting majority, we talk about speeding up the transition to clean energy like wind and solar. We decided to take a look at who was expressing support for preserving nuclear power plants. And you can see here that Republicans and independents favor preserving nuclear power at higher levels than Democrats. And support also differs by age. You can see 65 years and older have much higher support for nuclear than those folks who are younger. And then certainly Republicans are at 70% versus the Democrats who are at 57%. So some big deltas there. You can see here that women and Americans under 30 have higher levels of being uncertain about whether or not we should be preserving nuclear power plants. A lot of uncertainty here as well, particularly as opposed to favor and oppose. But if you go down the not sure column, you can see some very high numbers of not sure, a lot in the 20s, and even in the 30s. 34% of African Americans are not sure about that. So taking a look at, again, some of the demographics results around transitioning away from energy sources like oil, coal, and natural gas. If you really take a look into those demographics, you can see here that actually 54% of Republicans oppose rapidly transitioning away. So something to take into consideration, that folks want to move towards and not away. So towards clean energy versus away from dirty energy. So next we'll move on to how to fund these climate policies. There's a lot of rhetoric around who's going to pay for this. We decided to ask Americans what they think we should do to pay for some of these climate solutions. And so the two that we put on the table were, should we make polluters pay for the pollution they create? This is corporate polluters. The other one is increasing taxes on the wealthiest 1% of income earners. And we had some surprising results. We've shared already that Americans support making polluters pay for the pollution they create. It's a 44-point favorability. But it was really interesting to see the numbers around increasing taxes on the wealthiest 1%. We were surprised by some of those results. So 61% of Americans also supported this. And if you take a look at that strongly favor, 40% of Americans strongly favor this. So while the favorability is a lower shift versus making polluters pay, the intensity among those who favor it is much higher. And so we wanted to break that down. Who is pushing that intensity? Who is pushing that, and who is supporting that favorability? And if you see in here on this screen now, on the left-hand side, and making polluters pay for the pollution they create, men favor this more. Folks who are 40 to 49 to 50 to 64 and 65 and older, and Republicans favor this at higher margins than others, or they're more notable. When you take a look at increasing taxes on the wealthiest 1% of income earners, that is largely made up of African Americans, independents, who really push those numbers up. However, women a bit push the number up, younger folks ages 30 to 39, and so forth, are really, and Democrats are pulling these numbers up. If you take a look at who we're losing for taxing the wealthiest 1%, we're losing some Republicans and we're losing some Trump voters with this proposition. And so just to summarize, Democrats and independents are more strongly in favor of increasing the taxes. And so for those who work with Democrat or independent constituency, certainly that would be the preferred option. However, if you're working with Republicans, we suggest not focusing on taxing the 1% to pay for this solution. And you can see here the spreads of the numbers are quite dramatic. And so part of what we do, of course, is not just share our research, but we want to help you to be more successful in your work. If you choose to support Green New Deal or components of the Green New Deal, we've developed some talking points, or at least guidance, communications guidance. If you're speaking with or engaging with Democrats, of course, be solutions oriented. Democrats endorse a wide variety of policy solutions. So, it's a open for lots of work there. Also recognize that there is this populist energy. And so you can see on the last couple of slides that Democrats favored making the wealthiest 1% pay for climate solutions over making polluters pay, although they do support both. But just it's more about recognizing the populist energy there. As for Republicans, for those of you who feel comfortable in this space, highlighting the preservation of nuclear energy is successful with Republicans. It is the one area where Republicans are stronger than Democrats. And certainly instead of talking of moving away from fossil fuels, talk about moving towards clean energy and combine that with the job trainings to help communities to make that transition. Both of those are more successful with Republicans. Across party lines, I'll reiterate, we can talk about speeding up the transition to clean energy. And certainly there's a majority there. Highlighting the development of new technologies to remove carbon from the air is also successful, as well as emphasize the value of energy efficiency. We don't talk about energy efficiency enough as a practical and pragmatic solution. People feel that it is accessible to them. It's a win-win, it saves them money. And even we found that people connect it with jobs as well. So talking about an energy efficiency as part of the solution set is successful. Some of us have been in conversations when we're talking about climate change or solutions and people push back. Some of the quotes you see here are, especially on the Green New Deal, there's been a variety of criticisms about it. And our recommendation is to really speak from the mountaintops and not get into a mono argument with folks. So respond with talking about your values. Why are you leading on this issue? People understand that it's about our protecting our health, it's about our families, we have a responsibility to our children and grandchildren. We can talk about the problem after we've established our values and why we're leading. And you know, it's really about that corporations are trying to protect their profits and they're at it again. But we can't just leave it there. It's about moving towards a solution. We need to work together across party lines on solution, and speeding up this transition will protect our air, water, create jobs, reduce further damage to our climate. So we don't want to be myth busting. We don't want to restate their lies and give their lies airtime, but rather stick with the mountaintops, sticks to speaking from the mountaintops, and also to remember that you are representing your constituency, you're representing people, and to remember that you speak for the people and you speak for our health and our well-being and our future. And if you keep that, if you hold that as you're speaking with others about it, it's hard to attack, and so you'll be more successful keeping people front and center. So now I'm going to turn it over to Helena, who is going to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Megan. Okay, so our next speaker is Jennifer Watson-Roberts from ecoAmerica. Jennifer is the director of ecoAmerica's Path to Positive Communities program. She was the 58th mayor of Charlotte and is the only person to be elected to serve as both chairman of the Mecklenburg County Commission and later as mayor of Charlotte. She and her husband, Manly, live in Charlotte, but can usually be found on weekends hiking the North Carolina mountains. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Jennifer.
Super, thanks so much, Helena, and thanks, Megan, for that great presentation of the ecoAmerica research. And one of the things I'm going to talk about what some states and some cities and counties have done in response to the conversation on the Green New Deal. And one of the things that we have to remember is that many different people have very different views of what the Green New Deal actually is. There is legislation, the Senate has a version, it's the same as the House version. There's actually legislation written but it's not specific in many areas. It's more a vision. And so when it comes to things like how are we paying for it, et cetera, a lot of people have interpreted it different ways and used it either to support or to detract. So what we see happening at the state and local level is somewhat the same. One of the things that the Green New Deal has done, and I think it's actually kind of brilliant that they reference the New Deal, because the transformational aspect of the original New Deal under Roosevelt was not looking at just one issue, but looking at several issues at once. And so a characteristic of the Green New Deal, even at the local level, is to look at the intersectionality of issues that are affected by climate change and extreme weather. And so several governments at the local level have looked at not just the environment and clean energy and clean air, but they've also included things like workforce development, especially for displaced workers that are coming from the fossil fuel industry, looked at including underserved communities, and equity as a big part of the Green New Deal, and jobs are a big part of that. But some local governments have even talked about healthcare and education. And if you look at the legislation, the last section of it talks about healthcare, housing, economic security, as well as clean air and water. So it is a very comprehensive vision. And for some people, that's one of the things that makes it wonderful. And for other people, that makes it kind of scary. So what we find is that these local Green New Deal plans vary widely, as would be expected with varying geography, also varying amounts of authority. Some cities have control over the utilities, some have absolutely no control over their utilities, water or electricity. Some have control over building codes, some have less control. And so, and some are dealing with coastal issues and hurricanes, and others are dealing with drought and wildfires. But even in all these variations, again, they have their supporters and their critics. And in some places, they have started using parts of the Green New Deal without actually using the word Green New Deal, because it has been so associated with progressive values. And there are a lot of purple and red states in the country that do not want to be associated with those progressive values. One of the questions that came in before the webinar started was asking, why are there so many areas that are pushing back against the Green New Deal? So I just want to summarize a couple of those points, and then I'm going to move on to talk about some specific cities and states and what they've done. So some of the reasons that people are pushing back against a Green New Deal, it's not just the fossil fuel industry, and we know that the Koch brothers and others have vested interest in maintaining the profits from that industry. So it's not just that area. There are many reasons. One is that people are worried about the expense. The actual legislation is vague on what the green tax or carbon tax will be. Is there going to be a carbon tax? Will there be a tax on the wealthy? That hasn't really been spelled out, but a lot of people fear it's going to impact them. What they fail to do is look at the cost of doing nothing. They're not comparing that to the fact that, for example, in the past year, about 1/4 of the discretional congressional budget not related to defense was spent on disaster relief. So we know that climate change is costing us already. Another reason people oppose it is they're worried about job losses. And I'll talk a minute about the Los Angeles Green New Deal, where the union workers opposed it because, again, they were connected to fossil fuel and were worried about losing their jobs. Another reason for pushback, it's been equated with socialism. The fact of a just transition and the focus on equity, people see that as government intervention in the marketplace. They see that as socialism, and that has been exacerbated by the polarized nature of what's going on in Washington and the 2020 elections coming up. Other people push back because they think it is too broad, too sweeping, and therefore unrealistic. And House Speaker Nancy Pelosi even called it or dismissed it somewhat, calling it the green dream or whatever. Again, there are people who are more in the center who feel like it is trying to take on too much at once. People also see it as taking away their freedom. We actually hear people thinking that it is forcing people to drive electric cars, forcing people to live in smaller homes, forcing them to change their lifestyle. And the vision is that it is going to be transformational, but nobody is being forced individually to do anything in the way it's being spelled out. There is disruption and uncertainty that comes with a broad change. Some people think it changes too fast, and we saw that in the polling, that when you start to tighten up and say we want clean energy in 10 years, people start to get nervous and think it's not possible. Whereas if you talk about a transition over time, it's more digestible. People think that that's more possible. And then, of course, there's still the folks who actually don't believe the science. And we're not going to spend any time on them, but they're there. So, in looking at some of the manifestations of the Green New Deal, I just picked a couple. Again, there are over 20 states that have had some sort of 100% clean energy resolution passed, or a path to a clean energy future. There are, hundreds of cities that have had some sort of it, but I just picked a few, and wanted to talk a minute about them. The first one on the left you'll see is New York City. And New York, interestingly enough, is one of those cities that doesn't have control over a lot of things. The state actually controls things like water and utilities, but what they found is that 70% of their emissions come from their buildings. And they have very inefficient old buildings that are leaking heat and air conditioning. And so they passed a suite of bills compelling the owners of apartment and office buildings that were big, they had to be over 25,000 square feet, to retrofit their structures to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Now, what Bill de Blasio, who's also a candidate for president, did was to hyper-politicize it by holding the press conference in the Trump Tower, because the Trump Tower is one of the buildings that would be under these new laws, and it is very inefficient. You can see in the picture, if you look closely, there are some signs behind de Blasio that say Trump 2020. So when you make it political, you get political pushback. Moving on to Los Angeles, Mayor Garcetti introduced a sweeping sustainability plan, and he focused on increasing the number of zero emission vehicles in the city to 25% by 2025 and 100% by 2050. The mayor also wants to have electricity provided by the LA Department of Water and Power to have all of it come from renewable sources by 2045, which is in line with the state of California. And this plan was criticized both on the right and on the left. Of course, we know why folks on the right have criticized it. The Sunrise Movement actually opposed it and said, that's too long of a time frame. He also had the unions oppose this. The folks working for the Department of Water and Power and the Electrical Workers Union both came out, opposed it, had demonstrations in the street, and started criticizing the mayor for not focusing on homelessness enough. Again, all is pushback, worried about job loss. And one of the challenges there is that the mayor's office didn't bring the unions into this plan early enough to help them understand that there would be job transition and job retraining. And then also criticized the Green New Deal for being too car-centric and focusing too much on vehicles and not on so many other things that could be part of mitigation and adaptation for moving to a clean energy future. So compare that to, on the right, we have a young representative from Maine, Representative Maxman, who introduced a Green New Deal. And she started out working with labor and created an apprenticeship program for the construction of grid-scale electricity generation, including taking steps to add solar panels to school buildings. And so when she announced her Green New Deal that was passed by the legislature, the AFL-CIO publicly supported what she was doing. The last one on the slide is Rhode Island, and this is just a picture of some of the mapping that they're doing. They are the ocean state, and that means that they are severely impacted by rising sea levels and by extreme weather. Their plan calls for building more offshore wind turbines, but also addresses adaptation and resilience in dealing with eroding coastlines. So they include things like management areas for stressed fisheries, guidance for renewable energy sources, baseline monitoring and data collection, and vulnerability assessments of coastal infrastructure. They also have, as part of their plan, and a focus on increased public awareness and understanding of climate change and of how it is impacting them specifically where they are and neighborhood by neighborhood and even the coastal areas as well. So with all that being said, there are still a lot of challenges, and specifically what we see at the local level is much of it is based on stereotypes. It's based on talking points or snippets of conversation people hear. It's based on headlines, talking heads on the news. Much of it's based on misinformation. And what we have done at ecoAmerica and the program I'm with, which is Path to Positive Communities, which works specifically at the local level with cities and counties and some regions, we have tried to help people understand how do you avoid the instant pushback that comes with people who have a reinforced stereotype about a plan, about a phrase, Green New Deal, about its association with ultra progressive liberal values. There are even people out there who don't believe climate change because they don't like Al Gore. We try to help people avoid those pitfalls. And so we have, on the slide, you can see a number of the resources that ecoAmerica has produced based on research on messaging techniques and ways to counter some of that negative perceptions, the negative beliefs, and to meet people where they are on values that we all share. So instead of turning people away, to take those 15 steps, start with the common values, build on that, show the relevance to people's lives. We found that health is a big motivating factor for Americans, and so we have guidance on talking health and climate. We know that parents are very interested in health for their children. We know that the air quality and water quality are highly supported. And we also know that there are trusted messengers in the community, faith leaders and health professionals. And so we have guides that talk about the connection between health and climate, the connection between mental health and climate, and even how a faith leader would use their concepts of stewardship and bearing witness, and then providing refuge in terms of things like adaptation and resilience, and how that relates to the faith community and concepts that they are used to working with. So the Path to Positive Communities also has a new toolkit that we are going to be launching very soon that will have not just a moving forward guide that helps communities think about steps they can take to bring the community along and really get support on an individual basis. How can we empower individuals to take action, and also how can they support their community doing that? So we have that will be coming forward. We also will have some sample declarations in that toolkit. Many of these communities around the country that have pursued a Green New Deal have started out with a bold statement. We're going to reach 100% clean renewable by a certain date. Those declarations are important for giving people a vision and a direction. So we have some sample declarations in that toolkit. We'll have a checklist of certain things that your community can think about. We're all helping each other, that peer-to-peer sharing and learning that the Local Government Commission is so good at doing. We appreciate the contributions that all the folks on this line have probably made to that list of here's some ideas to think through, much like the cool streets and cool roofs that LA has pursued. What are some other great ideas for reducing urban heat, for helping people deal with climate, but also helping mitigate and reduce the impacts by planting trees and so many things that people do have access to. So remember, it's about that win-win scenario. It's about bringing people forward with positive views, avoiding the pitfall of trying to counter the myths, not repeating the science, that people have some bad science out there that they try to think is, you know, the correct way of viewing things, but talking about why we all want clean air and water and how we can all work together to make that future for our children and our grandchildren. So with that, that wraps up my part of the conversation. And again, appreciate everybody's attention. We are able to take some questions if people want to type those. There was one question that I answered during my presentation, and there's another one that has come in about the survey data, about why income inequality and the interest in that is not greater. And actually, a lot of that depends on how you ask the question, because I know that city leaders, people who are in charge of cities and counties, are talking quite a bit about income inequality. But the average American who's not looking at statistics, who's not working as a city planner or working as a mayor and trying to make sure they're serving all their residents, the average American is thinking more about their own prospects and their own future and their kids and their community. And, you know, again, there are going to be some folks who are very aware of that inequality and very concerned about it and working very hard on it. It does remain an important part of the Green New Deal. In fact, that's one of the things that characterizes it as much more than just an environmental proposal, because the whole concept of a just transition, of working with underserved communities, of recognizing that impacts have been harsher on low-income communities and on people of color. That is a big recognition out there. And I think, you know, in your work, you're going to find that people are becoming more and more aware of that gap. So we've got another question that just came in. What explains the popularity gap of protecting the environment versus addressing climate change? This is really interesting because I have an example in Southwest Florida where ecoAmerica has been doing some work, and there's a conservancy there that's been working for 20 years protecting wildlife and mangrove forests and sea turtles, and they've had people love this conservancy, they've supported it. All of a sudden, they started working on climate change and they started getting pushback. And they started, people who had loved clean air and water, love the animals and the plants, are not supporting the idea of working on climate. And it's absolutely the same thing, because mangrove forests help produce oxygen and help protect shorelines from sea level rise and from severe weather. So what we're training folks to do is to, again, focus on that win-win. You're already doing all the things that are helping the climate. You're already supporting the mangroves and the flora and fauna, because they're really like the canaries in the coal mine. If they're healthy, we're healthy. And what you're doing is supporting the health of your kids, the clean air. We don't want red tide. So it's all about framing it. Some communities don't even talk about climate. They just talk about clean air and water. They're doing many components of the Green New Deal, but they know they can't say it that way, and they can't talk about it as climate change. And I know that Megan has done a lot of work with that as well. If you wanted to add anything, Megan?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that one of the reasons you see splits in support for the environment, or what should be more important, the environment or the economy, is that that is go-to for organizations that are pushing back on environmental progress or pushing back on climate solutions. Their go-to argument is an economic one. It'll hurt us financially. And they're so successful at pushing that message that it has become part of Americans' mindsets on this issue. One of the things that I would, that we are going to be exploring more is really talking about the cost of inaction. You're seeing more work being done in this space, whether it's corporations talking about climate risk or health organizations talking about the the all-in cost of climate impacts on not only on our health, but the cost of health care. You're seeing cities think about the impacts of climate change on their communities and the cost of inaction there. And so we certainly have an opportunity to shift the narrative to, it's not an either or. It is both. We need to work on improving our climate and environment. We also want to make sure we maintain a healthy economy for all. And there are win-win solutions out there. I'm certainly both in investing in solutions that will secure our future and also avoiding the costs of inaction.
So another question has come in about the cost of renewables and the cost of electric vehicles, and pointing out that they are more cost effective. I think I saw recently that there is electricity at 2 cents a kilowatt hour in parts of California. And, we're paying over 8 cents where I'm from in North Carolina. So the question is, why are people opposing it when they know the costs are lower? And this gets back to the issue of infrastructure. So we know that transitions are hard. We have many, many pipelines and drills and gas plants that are in place that are employing workers in other parts of the country. And those workers all feel that their jobs are threatened. They're not hearing folks going around trying to train them to install solar panels. They're not seeing that enough. Some states have started doing that and really making those connections, like they did in Maine with the smart grid, and starting to train workers on that technology, on installing that and updating that grid. Other states are starting to get the idea. But the economic argument is a very strong one and a powerful one. And the challenges in parts of the country that are producers of fossil fuels or that are refiners of fossil fuels and that have deep traditions and infrastructure investments. So you have companies that are looking at the fact that they've put all this money into pipelines and gas plants and others, and their return on investment is going to take 10, 20 more years. And so there's a lot of pushback. That's one of the reasons we need to have more climate literacy and understanding in the general population, raising that political will that we talk about so much. Because when people understand that that electricity is available at that lower price and that it is going to cost more in the long run not to do the transition, they will start pushing back on their congressional representatives, on their local leaders, on their utility commissions to make that transition more quickly. So anything that we can do to help continue to educate the public on that cost differential is going to be extremely helpful. So here's another question that just came in. We hear that that solutions are a waste of time and money because it's not going to help in the long run. It's not going to help the climate. I hear this all the time. Look what India and China are doing. What we're doing is much smaller compared to what they're doing. And so, why should we even be making an effort? Well, first of all, we're supposed to be a leader as a nation. We're supposed to be the leader of the free world, and folks who have innovation, technology, solutions-oriented, can-do Americans. We should be the ones showing the way, and we should be helping, as we are, and many of those international organizations like C40 Cities, like ICLEI, like COP, like what the United Nations is doing. There is a lot of interaction with American technology in other countries, but we absolutely need to be leaders. The other thing is, even in the short term, the air is healthier. If we don't have coal plants, if we don't have natural gas, which we know produces methane and leaks in its extraction, we know that fracking causes a lot of disruption to water and to land. So if we take all of that away, even if we still see temperatures rise globally, our air and water are cleaner. And in the end, it is going to have an impact. There is going to be an impact to the global temperatures, the more and more that we can do this. And, it's kind of like your kid telling you, why should I pick up this piece of litter if someone else, on the other side of the street threw one down? Well, if everybody said that, we're not getting anywhere. We absolutely have to have our communities feel empowered and know they make a difference and know that people are watching. So do we have any other questions that have come in? What demographic groups can be persuaded to vote for climate policies besides young people? Megan.
That's a great question. I'd have to dig for the exact numbers, but we asked that very question. If you go to ecoamerica.org, and I could probably do it while I'm talking right now to find the exact numbers, but in October and November of last year, we did a couple of quick surveys where we asked Americans just those kind of questions. Would you vote for a candidate who supports climate change? And resoundingly, Americans said yes, some majorities. Specifically Democrats and even independents, but even Republicans, I want to say well over 40% of Republicans said that they would as well. But I'm not clicking fast enough to bring up the report, but yes, a majority would vote for them. I think that there is a real need for us in America to give our fellow Americans permission to lead on this issue. One of the questions we asked was, are you concerned about climate? 73% yes. Do you think other people around you are concerned? Only 59% clicked yes on that. So there's a real gap in people seeing leadership on this issue from people like themselves. And they need to know that people are concerned. They need to know that leadership can happen. They need to see their leaders working together on this issue. So I think we will get farther faster if leaders actually do try to work on this issue together across political parties. And if you take a look at the voting populace, I don't want to disregard Republicans, we need them in this. But if you simply also look at Democrats plus independents, that is a majority of Americans. Again, I do think we need to bring Republicans along on this issue, and many are trying to work at that. And Republicans certainly need that permission to lead. And more Republicans are coming forward on this issue. And so to the extent that we can support their leadership, the farther we'll get.
Absolutely. That is going to be important to making sure that candidates are answering questions about their climate action. And we had one last question come in about how are we going to pay for all this? And again, what I remind folks is the actual legislation is not specific. We know that cities, counties, states, and the national government set budgets every year, that there are varying factors that put pressure on them. We also know the cost of inaction, as I said, over $140 billion in 2018 was spent on disaster relief. And we know that that wasn't enough, because I live in a state where there's still a third of our counties that are suffering from flood damage in North Carolina. And we know that that is true for many parts of the country. We know that parts of California are still recovering from wildfires. And we know that there are areas in Texas and the Great Lakes and the Missouri and Mississippi rivers where people are still recovering from flood damage. And it could be years that it takes to do that. We know that expense is great. So whether it's a carbon tax, whether it is local bonds for transit and water and other improvements, electric vehicle charging stations, we have a lot of local communities, states, and city governments that are passing bonds or they're putting those in their budgets. That's going to come, whatever the format that it takes, it is going to be, in the long run, less expensive than doing nothing. And we are going to, as the impacts continue to grow, we are going to be paying anyway. The key is going to be planning in a right way to keep the cost minimal, but again, to explain the need. And I want to say real quickly before we end our hour, a couple folks have asked about the slides being available. Yes, the slides will be available. This webinar is being recorded. It will be downloaded on, it'll be on our website, it'll be on the local government commission's website, and we have many research materials, many more than what we showed you on the ecoAmerica website. There's also the pathtopositive.org website. and that is more specifically focused on communities, cities and counties, and what they're doing to reach out. There are 2 other programs of ecoAmerica, Blessed Tomorrow, that works with the faith community, and Climate for Health, and they have tremendous health resources. All those are available for free on all our websites. I want to say thank you so very much, and I'm going to turn it over to Helena for a very last thank you to all the folks who've been listening and joining us today. And thanks so much again to Megan as well. Helena.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer and Megan, for the wonderful presentations. Just want to reiterate Jennifer's points to encourage folks to visit the ecoAmerica and Path to Positive communities websites for all the materials and resources related to these presentations, and to say thank you for attending the webinar.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much. Have a great day.